Hello and welcome to this presentation on the approach ban in Canada. Some content for this video was produced by the Transportation Safety Board of Canada. I would like to draw attention to the generosity and the great availability of the TSB in the production of this video. Instrument-rated pilots should constantly review subparts 602 to 605 of the Canadian Aviation Regulations. CAR 602 Operating and Flight Rules specifies that takeoffs of all Canadian aircraft are governed only by the visibility. Approach restrictions are governed by the RVR values only, and landings are governed by acquiring appropriate visual references at published decision heights or MDAs only. Invented in 1965, the runway visual range was introduced in the United States in the early 70s. International airports in Canada and Europe followed shortly after. The goal was to help pilots to mentally prepare for the visual transition of the approach in marginal weather conditions. It was a decade later that regulators imposed approach bans based on RVR values, taking into account the intrinsic limitations of this electronic device. In human factors, the approach ban is an effective systemic countermeasure to prevent the pilot from succumbing to organizational or personal pressures to land in unacceptable weather conditions. The current approach ban regulations date from 2006, with a few exceptions when weather conditions at the aerodrome deteriorate below a specific value. The pilot must initiate a go-around at or before the final approach fix. Recently introduced, the aerodrome operating visibility is the minimum visibility allowed for ground operations, including taxi, takeoff, and landing. CAR 602-96 requires that the pilot in command of the aircraft shall be satisfied that the aerodrome is suitable for the intended operation. Initially, the aerodrome operating visibility was applied to the taxi out and takeoff flight phases, but its restrictions were later extended to the approach and landing. It is called the aerodrome operating visibility, but in practice it is the runway used that determines its value, not the aerodrome. That's the way it is. Let's see how the operating visibility is determined. This is the Sept-Îles Airport page from the CFS. Let's reach the runway data section so we can look at runway certification here. For runway 9, the CFS shows that the minimum operating visibility is 1200 RVR. We find the same reference for runway 27, which is surprising since the RVR is installed for runway 9 only. This could be an error we should report. Regarding runway 1331, we note here that there's no mention of operating visibility. Here is the Hull Beach Nunavut Airport under the heading Runway Certification, no operating visibility either. So how should the pilot determine whether or not he can legally taxi, take off, or land from an airport in inclement weather when the CFS does not specify the operating visibility? The answer is in the CFS, which remains the official reference. It goes well beyond what can be found in the Canada Air Pilot. Here is how to find the correct reference. CFS, Table of Contents. You go down the list to find runway and or heli data. This edition leads us to page A71. We look for runway data here, and as we did before, we look for runway certification. There is a note, C lowercase e. In this edition, the note E is found below, but it is necessary to continue reading until the 7th paragraph, which is here. It reads, if no runway visual range is published for the runway, then the operations are limited to the visibility of 2600 RVR, 1/2 statute mile, or above. So when there's no mention of operating visibility in the CFS, as it is the case for runway 13 at Sept-Îles, Quebec Airport, the value is 2600 RVR. Now you know where to find the answer. Let's see how, in 2020, the pilot determines if the approach can be continued beyond the FAF. We will consider the whole process, but in order to keep everything as simple as possible, if we can say so, we will omit the many exceptions mentioned in the Canada Air Pilot. The pilot must answer two distinct questions in no way related. The first question is whether we have a certified runway today or not, considering the reported visibility. The second question is whether we have the right to continue the approach beyond the FAF. So we begin with the CFS. On the airport page, we intend to carry the approach. And as we did earlier, we look under runway to runway certification. Is the aerodrome operating visibility specified for the intended runway or not? If not, now we know it automatically becomes 2600 RVR. We then open the CAP to CapGen page 16 to see how operating visibility should be determined today. Does the airport have an active control tower? Or is the tower closed? Perhaps there's no tower at all. All Beach Airport does not have a specified operating visibility. The reported visibility, therefore, has to be of at least half a mile. In other words, when the visibility goes below half a mile, we don't have a runway anymore. We have a concrete pad or a spacious parking lot, but we don't have a runway. The operating visibility requirement should be read as an absolute requirement, meaning the current or forecast visibility must be equal to or greater than the value stated in the CFS. It is not optional like a simple recommendation. Sometimes the runway is certified for 1200 RVR for daylight operations and 2600 RVR for nights. National air carriers sometimes mandate their flight performance department to analyze the operating visibility requirements for the destinations they serve and provides the information on custom-made approach plates. To determine if the approach can be continued beyond the FAF and notwithstanding the usual exceptions, the decision-making process begins with the Canada Air Pilot Approach Plate. The advisory visibility is shown as 1 statute mile. CapGen 24 mentions that commercial operators may, under certain conditions, continue the approach beyond the FAF if the visibility at the airport is equal to or greater than 3/4 of the advisory visibility. Some commercial operators are granted special authorizations to continue the approach beyond the FAF when the visibility is as low as 50% of the advisory visibility. In the case of Hall Beach, down to 1/2 statute mile. When all the conditions set in the special authorizations are fulfilled, the pilot may continue the approach, otherwise he has to revert to the 3/4 rule. Since September 2006 and following the lobby organized by the Canadian Owner and Pilots Association, individual pilots and private operators have 1200 RVR limit regardless of the approach plate advisory visibility, even if approach designers would recommend a visibility of 2 statute miles. For example, private IFR flights have a 1200 RVR rule. It concerns individual pilots in light airplanes, high-performance twin-engine like the MU-2, even multi-million-dollar corporate jets, as long as they're not operated commercially. Because of their very slow approach speed, helicopters have a 1200 RVR limit as well. Okay, now we have the applicable advisory visibility, and we compare it with the reported visibility to determine whether the approach can be continued beyond the FAF or not. When both answers are yes, the pilot may continue the approach beyond the FAF. When one or both answers are no, the pilot must perform go-around at or before the FAF. A major regulatory issue persists in Canada. In all cases, nothing or no one will prevent the pilot from continuing the approach. No one will mute the approach radio signal or will turn off the runway lights. No one will roll back the runway to close it completely. ATC will clear the pilot for the approach and will clear to land regardless of whether the approach was prohibited or allowed. By now you probably wonder how approach bans are regulated elsewhere in the world. Let's have a look. The pilot reads the approach chart and looks for the minimum visibility. Then she or he assesses whether the actual visibility is higher or lower. The answer is yes or no. When it's no, ATC will simply not clear the pilot for the approach. At almost every airport on the planet, published visibility is the minimum limit. In Canada, advisory visibility is a recommendation, not a minimum. The Canadian approach ban regulations will soon be reviewed as recommended by the Transportation Safety Board of Canada. I would like to thank the TSB for the content of this presentation and, of course, for the excellence of its work. Thank you and happy flights.